allies, and the Soviet Union and its allies have a mutually deep interest in a just and genuine peace and in holding the arms race. Agreements to this end are in the interests of the Soviet Union as well as ours, and even the most hostile nations can be relied upon to accept and keep those treaty obligations, and only those treaty obligations which are in their own interest. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal. Third, let us re-examine our attitude towards the Cold War, remembering we're not engaged in a debate, seeking to pile up debating points. We are not here distributing blame or pointing the finger of judgment. We must deal with the world as it is, and not as it might have been, had the history of the last 18 years been different. We must therefore persevere in the search for peace, in the hope that constructive changes within the communist bloc might bring within reach solutions which now seem beyond us. We must conduct our affairs in such a way that it becomes in the communist interest to agree on a genuine peace, and above all, while defending our own vital interests. Nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world. To secure these ends, America's weapons are non-provocative, carefully controlled, designed to deter, and capable of selective use. Our military forces are committed to peace and disciplined in self-restraint. Our diplomats are instructed to avoid unnecessary irritants and purely rhetorical hostility, for we can seek a relaxation of tensions without relaxing our guard. And for our part, we do not need to use threats to prove we are resolute. We do not need to jam foreign broadcasts out of fear our faith will be eroded. We are unwilling to impose our system on any unwilling people, but we are willing and able to engage in peaceful competition with any people on earth. Meanwhile, we seek to strengthen the United Nations, to help solve its financial problems, to make it a more effective instrument for peace, to develop it into a genuine world security system, a system capable of resolving disputes on the basis of law, of ensuring the security of the large and the small, and of creating conditions under which arms can finally be abolished. At the same time, we seek to keep peace inside the non-communist world, where many nations, all of them our friends, are divided over issues which weaken Western unity, which invite communist intervention, or which threaten to erupt into war. Our efforts in West New Guinea, in the Congo, in the Middle East, and the Indian subcontinent have been persistent and patient, despite criticism from both sides. We have also tried to set an example for others by seeking to adjust small but significant differences with our own closest neighbors in Mexico and Canada. Speaking of other nations, I wish to make one point clear. We are bound to many nations by alliances. These alliances exist because our concern and theirs substantially overlap. Our commitment to defend Western Europe and West Berlin, for example, stands undiminished because of the identity of our vital interests. The United States will make no deal with the Soviet Union at the expense of other nations and other peoples, not merely because they are our partners, but also because their interests and ours converge. Our interests converge, however, not only in defending the frontiers of freedom, but in pursuing the paths of peace. It is our hope and the purpose of Allied policy to convince the Soviet Union that she too should let each nation choose its own future, so long as that choice does not interfere with the choices of others.
I hope you picked up some things. That's kind of hard. I watch it 3 dozen times, so I have a little better way of picking things up. Anybody pick up anything there that he was maybe emphasizing? Anybody at all? Don't be bashful. Nobody picked anything up, or just being bashful.
I noticed his thing had the same thing in person.
Oh, well, that's very nice. I'm looking for something he said that he might have been making a point about. Anybody pick one up?
We should work towards peace, but at the same time be assured, like the Allies and the American people, that they weren't going to make a deal with Russia at the expense of the Allies.
And where were they going to defend at all costs? West Berlin. Every president since Kennedy defended West Berlin until the wall came down. Every president would have gone to war over West Berlin until the wall came down. So some other things he said, you didn't probably maybe pick this up right away, but he made a good point. All we're doing is having a big military buildup on both sides, communist, non-communist. Why don't we take that money and spend it on poverty and disease? Okay, all we're doing is making weapons and then making counter weapons to that, and then making counter weapons to the counter weapons, and then counter weapons to the counter. I mean, it's a military buildup that he just didn't believe in. And he says, let's not point fingers, right? Let's deal with Earth as it is, not as it was. You know, it's a really difficult thing for people to do. And I mean, this is a minor thing. I'll give you a perfect example. We had a driver's ed program here many years ago in which the class was in the summer. And you took the class in the summer. And if you got a C in driver's ed, it went on your transcript and counted towards your GPA. And we had a young man here who was probably the smartest kid ACT-wise we've ever had, who had straight A's, who got a C in driver's ed. And when he got that C, I went and talked with the superintendent, the board, and said, listen, we got to change this policy. This kid is not going to be valedictorian. He's not going to be salutatorian. And his GPA is not going to be a 4 point because he's an average driver. And they would not change it. And I spoke with one particular board member and I said, you know, you've got to change this. This is ridiculous. And the response I got was, well, we've been doing this the same way for 20 years. And my response was, well, just because you're doing something wrong for 20 years doesn't mean you need to continue to do wrong. So my point is, we needed to deal with that issue as it was today, not how it was for the last 20 years, because it wasn't good. And that's his point that he's making. And people do that all the time. It's not just in this situation. I thought this was great. He said, as nuclear powers, we must avoid the scenario of either humiliating retreat or nuclear war. Right? I mean, is that the case in the Cuban Missile Crisis in a way? Somebody was going to have to fold and retreat in humiliation, or they were going to have to fight war. He said that's a bad scenario. He's talking directly about the issues of the Cuban Missile Crisis when he said that. Again, nuclear powers, we must avoid humiliating retreat or nuclear war. That's not a good choice, one or the other. We've got to start talking. If you also listen a little bit, and like I say, you saw it once, and I've seen it 100 times, but he's really making it clear that that non-nuclear or conventional weapons are what we need to do. What he said in his presidency in the start is that these weapons are made to deter, not start a war. And we got to get away from this situation here. He talked about threats, and he talked about West Berlin, and the fact he made it clear that under no circumstances would we ever compromise West Berlin. You also might have picked up that the United Nations was having some financial problems, and he said we need to commit some funding to the United Nations so we can continue the peace process, because that's really where the peace process in a way started in the Cuban Missile Crisis, was the disclosure that there were missiles in Cuba. He also was very much into, and it would have been hard to catch, he was also very much into the getting rid of nuclear weapons. And he finally, in his presidency, before he was assassinated, which is probably the thing he would remember the most, he got a test ban treaty passed, which we're going to talk about, that limited or banned the testing of nuclear weapons, which he thought would mean people would reduce their arsenals, because he was so against nuclear weapons. Conventional weapons are great. We've got to have weapons to deter people, but we don't need weapons to start a war. And I thought it was always kind of interesting because one of the things George Washington said when he left office way back in the late 1700s, 1790s, is to what? Let's avoid permanent alliances. That's all we've got now, is permanent alliances. And one of our allies has trouble. It happened in World War I, didn't it? With the assassination of Franz Ferdinand and that big thing that turned over that happened in World War II. We were trying to stay out of it, but when Japan bombed us, then we got in it. But alliances will get you in trouble. But you have to have them. It's kind of like, you know, life or car insurance. You can't live with it, you can't live without it. You got to have it, but it's not necessarily good. You know what I mean? You pay your whole life for auto insurance and never have a wreck. You sure wasted a lot of money. Okay, but you can't go without it, because by the time you didn't have it, you got a wreck, you'd be liable for whatever happened to everybody else. So it's one of those things. So anyway, the peace speech was a very popular speech, and a lot of people really remember that. So let's go to our last subtopic. Oh, no, it's not our last, but our next to last. Why did the Soviet Union place missiles in Cuba? My God, why did they put us in this position? We'll see after I talk to you whether you think it was justified. Yeah, and you know, you write down what you want, we're recording it, but I want to kind of tell the story. So picture this in your mind. In April of 1962, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, 6 months before the Cuban Missile Crisis, Premier Khrushchev and one of his generals were walking along the beach of the Black Sea facing the country of Turkey. Okay, now I want you to picture that. So again, in April of 1962, 6 months before the Cuban Missile Crisis, Premier Khrushchev and one of his generals is on Soviet land. They're standing on the shores or beaches of the Black Sea, and they're looking towards Turkey. And what are Khrushchev and his general discussing? No, those American missiles that are already located there. Pretty close, weren't they? Were they much farther away than the missiles in Cuba to the United States? And they're talking about these missiles that the Americans had placed in Turkey. And Khrushchev and the general started talking, and they both began to realize that the United States was basically surrounding the Soviet Union with nuclear missiles. Right? They're putting them all around the Soviet Union. Now, at this time in history, you know how many missiles, nuclear missiles, the United States had? 5,000. You know how many the Russians had? 300. Now, you think about that if you're the Russian side of this. You're looking out your back door into Turkey, and all you're seeing is the thought in your mind of missiles close to your country. Then you're thinking, gee whiz, those guys have 5,000 missiles and we have 300. What else was in the back of Premier Khrushchev's mind that happened in Cuba? The Bay of Pigs, right? So he's thinking, and on top of this, the United States approved an invasion into Cuba, which is a communist ally of ours, with the intent to overthrow the dictator there, who we support. This is all going through this guy's mind, right? So, at that point, Khrushchev said, he has the same intention. I'm going to use Cuba just like the United States is using Turkey. That's where it came from. That's where this whole thing came from. And in a way, I mean, let's not, I don't think anybody's a communist here, but do you blame him? He's got 5,000 nuclear weapons in the United States, 300 at his disposal. He's got nuclear weapons in Turkey not far away. And he thinks of all this. He thinks about the Bay of Pigs, the fact that we went into Cuba. We didn't, but we supported that failed adventure. And he makes the decision, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to use Cuba just the way the United States is using Turkey. So, in May of 1962, Cuban and Russian officials, which would include Castro and Khrushchev, meet to discuss the possibility of putting nuclear missiles in Cuba. Again, they meet in May of 1962. Both officials from Cuba and Russia get together and decide the possibility of putting nuclear missiles in Cuba. This meeting went on for multiple days, and who's got to agree to have nuclear missiles in his country? What? Fidel Castro. And after discussing this for several days, Cuban dictator or Cuban leader Fidel Castro agrees to allow these Russian missiles to be placed in his country. Now, this secret operation of placing nuclear missiles in Cuba had the code name Anadar, which was actually named after a Siberian city, and it's on your ID sheet. Anadar. So this Soviet operation of placing nuclear missiles in Cuba would have the code name Anadar, and it would be named after a Siberian city. So, in July of 1962, 85 Soviet ships leave Russia, heading to Cuba, carrying the following. Okay? In July of 1962, 85 Soviet ships left Russia, carrying the following. This is what's on these 85 ships. What's on the ships? What? Well, no, specifically what's on these ships? Yeah, 60 nuclear missiles. Did we ever see them all? No, 60 nuclear missiles were on these ships. What else was on those ships that were going to get the missile sites operational? Russian soldiers. Russian soldiers were on the ships. Military trucks, which I think you saw in some of the video, right? Military trucks. And fighter jets. That were, these fighter jets' wings would fold up, right? Fighter jets. So on those 85 Soviet ships that left Russia in July of 1962, what it had on them were Russian soldiers, 60 nuclear missiles, military trucks, and fighter jets. Now, once these Russian ships entered the Caribbean, the United States began to fly over those ships and take photos. They took photos of the ships in July of 1962. They were paying attention, right? Now, once the photos were developed, American officials recognized the fighter jets and military trucks on the ships, but they didn't notice the soldiers or the missiles. But they knew they were taking fighter jets and military trucks in there. That didn't bother us that much, but it would lead to further investigations, which meant further flights. Okay, so picture that. So once the Russian ships entered the Caribbean, the United States began flying over the Soviet ships and taking pictures. Just like we talked about, once the pictures were taken and developed, the American officials recognized the fighter jets and the military trucks, but they did not recognize the missiles and really didn't pay attention to if they were soldiers. Well, the ships get into Cuba, the Russian soldiers offload the missiles, and they do it in the morning while it's dark. And the Soviet soldiers wore civilian clothing and were not permitted to speak Russian at any time, because they're disguising them as Cubans. Okay? Because they know they're being photographed, right? Well, on August 29th of 1962, another U-2 spy plane went over Cuba. And guess what they showed being constructed? Not the missiles, SAM sites. The surface-to-air missiles that shot down who? Major Anderson. So they knew they had SAM sites there. And that became more of a concern. So what did they order again? More flights, which led to the flight that developed October 14th, 1962, that led us into the Cuban Missile Crisis. So backing up again, Once in Cuba, the Russian soldiers offload the missiles early in the morning while it was dark. Soviet soldiers wore civilian clothing and were not permitted to speak Russian while in Cuba. On August 29th of 1962, a U-2 spy plane shot photographs of Cuba, and it showed the surface-to-air missiles, the SAM missiles that shot the rockets up and shot down Major Anderson. Because of that, they wanted further flights, and the next flight was October 14th, 1962, which showed the missiles on the ground and the missile launching pads, which led us to the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's all I have on the Russian side, but are they not justified in doing what they did? Absolutely. But we got a crisis. So, I just want to, before we finish tomorrow, we'll have a short lecture on the test ban treaty and watch the video. Isn't it kind of interesting that way, way back on the first day of the crisis, Adlai Stevenson says what? Yeah, maybe we should trade our Jupiter missiles in Turkey for these missiles in Cuba. And people thought the man was out of his mind, right? And look at how this thing has taken this turn over 13 days, and we went right back. The only thing we did different is we didn't take them out for 6 months to save face. Kind of an interesting story. What's that? Yeah. Or, well, Gitmo, that was just something he threw in. I don't think that even mattered. That's a good point. Now listen, we'll talk about Kennedy's nuclear test ban treaty, which is a very short lecture tomorrow. We will spend the rest of the time watching the video. Here's how the rest of the year is going. You're going to have a Part 3 worksheet to fill out on this. I am not going to give you a test. I'm going to give you a biography instead, a full-blown biography. It'll be worth 100 points instead of 50, and you can pick anyone you want other than Bobby Kennedy and John Kennedy to write the biography on that was involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Dean Russ,